Censorship can never decrease the demand for anything. It can only ever restrict the supply. And any child can tell you what happens when you disrupt supply and demand in that fashion. Now, you really would think I would be belaboring the obvious at this point when I say censorship bad. But if recent news is anything to go by, apparently this particular equine is far from dead, and amply deserving of yet another beating. But instead of repeating the obvious, let's instead talk about why censorship and attempts to enforce control over the internet is utterly pointless in the end. And especially in our current interconnected age, the consequences of doing so are both disastrous and eminently predictable. So, returning to the sentence that I am so very proud of, censorship can never decrease the demand for anything, it can only ever attempt to restrict the supply. We have countless examples of this being true, and borne out again and again and again during various attempts to control access to various things, ranging from the obviously destined to fail, such as the prohibition of alcohol in the 1920s America, a situation that bears a startling resemblance, actually, to what we're seeing today in many ways, and so we will be using it as a primary reference and means of illustrating the inevitable consequences of all of this in this video. And the sentence remains true even all the way up to stuff that you would think would be easy and popular to ban and censor, and thus in turn, of course, that could be effectively banned. And yet, no matter how popular a ban on certain things would seem to be, the previous statement about supply and demand still holds true. As, at this point, I have arrived at the conclusion that opposition to censorship and control over freedom of expression or similar things to it needs to be an absolute. All censorship needs to be seen as automatically bad. All infringement upon freedom needs to be seen as automatically bad, near regardless of how repugnant you think the things being censored is, with only the narrowest and rarest of exceptions to this rule, well, being things that are universally, as in the 99% majority of the population universally, seen to be immoral. This is our ever-present exception to every rule. The obvious things that need to be banned, like CP, or actual literal rape and murder pornography, etc. And even then, even with things like that, we can never actually eradicate these things, no matter how hard we try. But talking about that would already be a bit of a downer, so let me instead take a slightly more humorous and internety example with which to demonstrate white women's proclivity to find alternative uses for the family canine.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
Yes, the meme is quite unfortunately very, very real. Despite the fact that plowing the pooch is considered stridently illegal in pretty much, well, the entire world, even in the land of the free, the US of A, which banned it in 2005, after a horse fucked a man to death in Washington. And yes, that really did happen, and no, it sadly was not a politician, it was an airplane engineer from Boeing. Anywho, whilst this legislation came one deep dicking too late, it is now no longer allowed to go doggy style with the doggy in America. And yet, the popularity of the dog pill meme and repeated arrests suggest that white women's enthusiasm for the Labrador Retriever remains undiminished, even in the case of it being, well, hazardous. God, I hope that's a fake article. Anyways, the simple fact is that out of the 8 billion or so post-Neanderthal savages that currently inhabit this big blue ball of ours, some of them are going to have pretty unique interests. There is a reason why we as a species felt the need to come up with a term for wanting to fuck trees. Fortunately, we have now arrived at a degree of civilization that allows 99% of us to agree that certain things are actually bad enough to ban, with virtually universal agreement of all. Those are the aforementioned extremes, although even then, even in the case of the near universal rejection, it still happens. So, to move on from the grim reality, if even shit like that simply cannot be controlled, despite the countless best efforts of thousands of law enforcement officers, what do you think will be the result, then, of our current wave of censorship and digital ID? In the immortal words of Blade, the one and only Blade, some motherfuckers just can't stop ice skating uphill. And this is where we arrive at the very useful and near parallel example of prohibition. Now, most of you have already heard about the United States' ill-advised attempt to ban alcohol in the 1920s. And at first blush, it may not seem to have any immediate similarities with today's case, but au contraire, mon ami. The two are, on a fundamental level, extremely similar. Let us begin with the root cause for the two, shall we? Moral outrage. Today, it is collective shout pulling porn games off Steam, or more likely being used as an excuse to do so by Visa and Mastercard. And in 1920, it was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who used political and moral pressure, just like collective shout, to enact the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, along with other, less successful campaigns. Strangely familiar, that one. A bunch of aggressively ugly women casting stones on the things, stealing the men's attention away. Almost like a certain jeans commercial and its reactions from a few days ago. Anyways, the point is that the current censorship nonsense stems from much the same place. In fact, if anything, porn and its ilk is even simpler and more popular to attack. As I talked about in my Porn is Our Canary Down the Coal Mine video, pornography is our first warning sign of impending censorship and the mounting attempts to cancel and remove entertainment and things in general of the internet, as it is easy to attack porn from both the left and the right hand of politics, both loudly shrieking that it is harmful and thus must be banned. Good old moral panic. And even if we were to say that, at least sometimes, this would all stem from a well-meaning place, as it does on occasion, even if very misled, it ignores the human component in all of this, and that is the reason why it fails again and again, and has failed over and over again throughout human history. See, even if we were to assume that collective shout is completely correct, and that all porn is violence against women, as they claimed in their petition to the EU and countless times on their website, And that is a mighty big assumption to make, that a 3D model getting choked somehow affects all women, especially considering another frequent female fetish. I guarantee you that the Collective Shout member who was combing through Steam for those games, she has one hell of an interesting Steam library. But again, even if we assume they are correct, the human need to jerk off is probably our oldest instinct. Literally. The very first known depiction of a human is the Venus of Hohlfels, depicting a chick with enormous tits and massive hips. It is the big boobs anime girl of 40,000 BC. And if the last 40 millennia worth of time hasn't managed to rewire the urge to choom over anything and everything, including woolen mammoth tusks carved into the rough simulacrum of an anime girl, then somehow I find it excessively difficult to believe that a bunch of screeching moral busybodies with very suspect preferences of their own is going to manage to do so now. And if your entire movement and argument for banning something is built solely on moralistic browbeatings and of the wishes of a payment processor, then this will inevitably lead to the same thing that happened during Prohibition: widespread discontent with the new rules and non-compliance, especially in the face of ever more stringent legal restrictions or methods of police enforcement that affect the populace, such as online ID checks. Now, during Prohibition, something like half of all men drank alcohol and decided they wanted to continue drinking alcohol, and so found a near infinite number of ways to circumvent the ban. We're already seeing examples of this happening now as well, whether it be through VPNs or other ways to fool facial recognition software. And if 50% of men still wanted to drink, 100% of humans need and wish to gratify themselves sometimes. So the disregard for rules like porn bans or internet ID will be even more widespread and common. And in addition to all the ways people will find to circumvent such things on their own, as government control can only ever suppress supply and never diminish demand, the demand will continue to rise, and rise, and rise due to ever-increasing suppression, until we have a flourishing black market offering ways to satisfy the demand. This, too, of course, happened during Prohibition, with the rise of criminal elements that earned absolute bank of the exploding profit potential in alcohol. For example, the price of about a gallon of alcohol, or 4.5 liters, could sell for $12 during Prohibition. That's about $200 in today's money for absolute rot gut. And on average, the cost of even legal alcohol quadrupled. And on the black market, the good stuff was far more expensive again than that. Now, of course, things like porn and uncensored access to the internet is sometimes a physical item, whether it be a literal magazine or, say, some sort of local internet stick or some way to circumvent various restrictions like a VPN. The point is, it might not be a physical item, and so in ways it is both easier and harder to distribute this commodity. But if the profit margins are big enough, there will be a solution. Which then brings about the third and probably biggest of all the problems. Assuming the public outcry against the ID and censorship is not enough to cancel it, and it rarely, if ever, is, as seen in the UK right now. When the government decides to do something, it practically always just does it, bulldozing it through regardless of the actual feelings of the populace. And with elections every 4 to 5 years, and the need for alternatives that actually represent the people to rise up in the political arena, etc., the wheels of democracy turn very slowly, if they turn at all. Take, for example, affordable care in the US or Obamacare. Now, I know this is pretty much apples to oranges here, but just to give you an idea of the time scope required. The act was signed in 2010. In 2024, during the presidential election, Trump claimed to have a plan to modify or scrap it completely after attempting to do so in his previous term. And we're now in 2025, with the act still largely intact, with only token efforts in place to try to begin to hobble it rather than get rid of it. That is 15 years and counting for an act that, whether you support it or not, has clearly been very controversial. Or another example, Roe versus Wade. The famous abortion case was ruled on in 1973, which in essence legalized abortions in the US on a federal level. That was and has been extremely controversial pretty much throughout its entire lifetime. And yet it too was only repealed in 2022, 49 years later. Again, regardless of whether you agree or not, it is clear for all to see that legal and political processes in our modern-day democracies make banana slugs look like space shuttles. All of this is to say that once the shit starts rolling downhill, you're not going to be stepping out of the splash zone in time. And you are going to drown on it on a very, very, very long time before being able to resurface from underneath the sea of sludge. So, we now have a rather unfortunate mix of things. A wildly unpopular decree from the government, leading to widespread resentment of the decree, and in turn aforementioned government. Following this, we have law enforcement attempting to enforce said unpopular decree, themselves becoming objects of mockery at first, and eventually outright hatred. This obviously is going to make the already impossible task of policing the internet much harder, as pretty damn quickly, the general populace will be more likely to side with the black marketeers and equivalent criminals than with the authorities. A classic Robin Hood situation, one that is once more borne out in our example of Prohibition, as initially the bootleggers were highly romanticized. Al Capone was a damn celebrity, and many early movies like Scarface, Little Caesar, or The Public Enemy further idealized the view of the mafia and gangsters. It wasn't until later, and after a lot of violence, that the public view started to shift. The violence, by the way, being another side effect of Prohibition in and of itself. The criminal enterprises had always been there, but now they started making money hand over fist, tons of money, which allowed them to hire tons of people and tons of guns, and realized that they could earn even more money by using all of those trigger-happy employees to muscle in on other criminal organizations' territory. Sharing, however, was not a mafioso virtue, and since nobody was going to leave literal billions of dollars in profit on the table, disagreements grew frequent and eventually deadly. A fortuitous event for Brigadier General John T. Thompson, by the way, whose lovely and famous little invention, the Thompson gun, was just a little bit too late for World War I, but just in time to popularize the drive-by in America. Eventually, as it became clear to everyone that enforcement wasn't working, that demand didn't shrink, and that having a product everybody wanted be illegal would only lead to massive black markets that in turn transformed into massive crime syndicates. Prohibition was eventually repealed. And now, 100 years later, we're apparently going to be learning the precise same lesson again. Although this time, it might actually be worse, as we're not just censoring something it is within the very nature of human beings to want, but we're also slapping on tyrannical ID controls that everyone recognizes to be a disaster in the making, as the government will no doubt hasten to abuse their newfound powers, as they always do. And along with the ever-increasing cost of living, the ever more complex financial situation across the world, etc., well, we are the Roman Empire, 6 weeks after running out of circus due to our entertainment being taken away for years now, and 6 weeks away from running out of bread, too. Sadly, all I can do is point all of this out at the moment, as frankly, I have no functional solution right now. The people that control our payments are dead set on bringing us down this path, as I recently discovered. And the people that rule our nations are marching in lockstep right behind them. Meaning that all of the current monetary and political power is focused behind making this monumentally terrible decision again, during a time with significantly greater tensions on nearly every level, and with a lot more potential for events to spiral. But, on a completely unrelated note, though, one of the few worthwhile things to ever come out of France, the humane way of ridding oneself of unelected leaders, the guillotine, is 233 years old this August. In fact, its birthday, as in its ever first application, is August the 21st. An intriguing piece of trivia that for no particular reason I thought might tickle your pickle. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.